This is Kosmographia, the Randall Carlson podcast.
And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Kosmographia Podcast. We are here to discuss whatever Randall wants to talk about. Right.
Yep.
That's right. And I think we're done with Atlantis. We're moving on to all things Younger-Dryas.
Actually, we'll never be done with Atlantis. Atlantis will be hovering over us no matter where we go. We can't talk about the Younger-Dryas without the implication of Atlantis, because the story of Atlantis, right, is set right into that milieu of transition between Pleistocene and Holocene, which is something we're going to really get into in depth, because it's such a critically important time in our planetary history and in the history of the human species. So it's a time that warrants much deeper scrutiny and consideration. So I see everybody's here, the usual suspects.
Right.
The Shiny Brothers, Brad, Normal Guy, we're all here, so I guess we're good to go.
We are good to go.
Okay.
Working on the shiny. We're trying to increase it. So, working on it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are some salves or
Yes.
some unguents.
Well, and we will catch up, so we're not 4 episodes behind of people actually seeing what we're talking about. So yeah, in a month or two, we'll actually get caught up where the
That's
newest ones are actually being seen that in real time.
That's right. And that'll allow us to really delve more into current events. Right now, it's kind of pointless to do events because the posting of the videos and everything is about a month or so behind. But
right,
we're catching.
I'm on episode 6. You guys are doing episode 7. We're now recording episode 11. So yeah, maybe another month, and we'll synchronize everything.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, Brad, could you maybe tell us a little bit about your backdrop there?
Well, I just took a trip with the big RC up to Minnesota. So this is Gooseberry Falls, and I selected this one out of probably a dozen good ones I've got, because there's all kinds of gorges and slot canyons and pothole integrated stream beds flowing into the north shore of Lake Superior. So I spent time while Randall was at a 3-day retreat exploring up from Duluth, Minnesota, up to Grand Portage, which is right next to the Canadian border there. The Pigeon River defines the border with Canada, and just an amazing drive, amazing group of state parks and hikes that you can make. And this one is the Middle Falls. Behind me is the Middle Falls of Gooseberry Falls State Park, which is the one closest in that stretch to Duluth, Minnesota. So yeah, it's totally worth making that drive if you're anywhere near that part of the country. And I want to add in there, because it seems that the water's brown. I noticed that right away. That's kind of root beer colored, and that's what one of the guys that run the gate at the entrance to the park said, well, there's a reason if I can spoil it for you. And I said, yeah, go ahead and tell me. He said, well, it's brown because the organic matter up in the swamps upstream on the highlands from here. So it's not necessarily from the rocks or from this or that. It's organic matter that makes the water brown like that. But all these different falls are root beer colored.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and of course the falls, the slot canyons, the potholes, the cliffs, all of this is a legacy of the big meltdown that occurred at the end of the last ice age. Completely created this landscape.
Which we were looking at, on the trip with the drumlin fields there in Wisconsin, and there were others in Minnesota that I didn't get quite out to, but we recently published a video on the potential of Lake Nipigon being an impact site. So all these features are pretty much directly south and in line with an outflow that could have been subglacial flooding after an impact into that Lake Nipigon region. This everything around Lake Superior and the outlet of the south end of Lake Michigan near Chicago that flows into the Illinois River that we explored a little bit. I mean, yeah, it's just it seems to make a lot of sense if that was an impact site there at Nipigon, just north of all these places.
Yeah, and so we will be exploring that in much more detail so that folks listening to this can kind of get the picture and how it all fits together. But yeah, we on this trip, we did our second exploration of the Illinois River, which was a conduit for huge amounts of meltwater that were essentially issuing from the southern terminus of the Michigan lobe of the Laurentide Ice Sheet, which would be right pretty much in the area of Chicago. We then, last year, explored the Wisconsin River. Was it the year before? Maybe, but we've explored the Wisconsin River, which was a drainage of what is so-called Glacial Lake Wisconsin, which was just a massive puddle of meltwater. And we'll get into that. It created some extraordinary landforms, including the Wisconsin Dells, which actually is pretty much of a tourist area in Wisconsin. A lot of people might know about Wisconsin Dells, particularly if they're from the Midwest. So the Wisconsin River was a conduit for massive flows. And then, of course, the Mississippi, also a conduit for gigantic meltwater flows. To the west of there, the Minnesota River was also massive flows, and it served as the conduit for the southern drainage of Glacial Lake Agassiz. So all of these various elements we will be putting together in a coherent presentation so people can get the whole picture of what happened, or at least to the extent that we now understand it. But yeah, so here's the thing. Most of the river valleys in North America are legacies of these gigantic flows, even the ones that didn't head directly onto the ice sheet, because they were the recipient of massive precipitation events, pluvial events, if you want to use that term, pluvial, which means rainfall, even in the southeast. And again, we'll be looking at that too, so that we see some of the landscapes of the southeast, the southwest, the northeast, how the whole continent basically bears the imprints of these massive catastrophic episodes that not only terminated the last ice age, but even go back further than that to even earlier catastrophes. The problem is, when you're trying to understand the earlier catastrophes, is that when you have a succession of catastrophes or cataclysmic events, the younger ones tend to largely obscure the older ones. But once you've kind of teased out the nature of these landscapes, you can then begin to almost perceive in certain areas through the existing configuration to see that there's older landscapes that have maybe been oftentimes buried. Because, whenever there's erosion, you have material being transported. That means somewhere else you have deposition. It means that where one landscape is getting stripped away, somewhere else there's a corresponding landscape that's getting buried. And so between the stripping away and the burying, oftentimes whatever was there before, the previous world, the previous landscape, is not there anymore. So, and that's the thing that I am hoping that one of the insights that comes out of this series that we're going to do is that people really begin to understand how extreme the remodeling of this planetary surface was during the last glacial termination, and then with that insight in hand, being able to look back and realize, yeah, we've had multiple episodes of planetary remodeling, if you will, and each one tends to eliminate largely the landscapes that went before. So if you had any kind of culture, any kind of civilization, which gets us back to that question, that existed 20 or 30,000 years ago, it wouldn't be surprising that it's been largely erased. And so, this constant question of, well, where are the potsherds? Where are the toolkits? Where's the evidence that there were people, existing back then? Well, that's what many of those, skeptics, if you will, of an older culture have failed to understand is the extent to which the planetary surface has been completely rearranged. And once you understand that, then you begin to see, oh, yes, I can now see why we wouldn't expect to find a lot of evidence, because that world doesn't exist anymore, literally. So,
Right.
and I mean, we've been talking about Atlantis as kind of using that as a metaphor. And I want to make it clear here. I am not saying that we found Atlantis. This is Atlantis. And I'm not really saying that. What I'm saying is that this could be. It could be, because it's consistent. That's what I'm trying to show, is that it's consistent with really the only real account we have. So what I'm saying is not necessarily even that this was Atlantis. I think what I'm really trying to say is that there could have been a culture on a group of large islands in the mid-Atlantic during the last ice age. I don't know about the climate, the ocean, the nature of the changes, and so on, and what we've seen in terms of the vertical movements and so on. I mean, so what we're saying is that there could have been.
Yeah.
You can't just a priori rule out the possibility that there could have been a, sophisticated maritime culture, right? We're not, you notice we're not saying anything about flying machines or crystal technology or aliens or any of that. And I'm not saying that they may, that someone back whenever, and we're going to get into that in future episodes. Certainly the idea that there was much more sophisticated advanced knowledge in prehistoric times than the standard models have recognized. I mean, I think we all have looked into this thing enough to know that there's just the anomalies and the coincidences are too great. It gets to the point where you can kind of keep sweeping things under the rug for just so long until finally there's no more room under the rug anymore and everything just starts spilling out. And that's kind of where we're at now. There's just, you walk in, there's a big lump in the middle of the room of the carpet, and under that is all of this stuff that doesn't make sense within the standard paradigm of prehistory. So in that context, it'd be good to start looking in more detail at that series of changes that marked the transition from the Pleistocene epoch into the Holocene epoch. And the Holocene epoch is the one we're in basically now. It means the whole of the modern, or the whole of the recent era. That's, Holocene, and scene means recent, just like when you look at all of these names that go back, you have the epochs, and the epochs are part of the periods, and the periods are part of a greater category. So when we get down to the detail of the Pleistocene Holocene transition, we have sub-stages that we name. We were talking about that earlier. We've got the Older-Dryas. That's followed by the Bering stage. That's followed by the Alarode or Alarod stage. That is then followed by the Younger-Dryas, and the Younger-Dryas is followed by the Pre-Boreal. So these are the terms that geologists and climatologists will contrive in order to be able to talk about it without always going, oh, well, that period of from 10,900 to 11,600 years ago, we give it a name, and everybody who's interested in this quickly learns the name and knows what they're talking about when you say the Pre-Boreal or the Younger-Dryas. And it's interesting to me that 5, 6, 7 years ago, virtually nobody outside of the geological community or scientific community, which might have included geologists, paleontologists, maybe paleoclimatologists, nobody really knew what the term, or was not familiar with the term Younger-Dryas. And I think it'd be safe to say that now probably millions of people have heard the term Younger-Dryas. So that has been, because when I was early on studying this things, in the late 80s and early 90s, especially when it was just first being appreciated that the Younger-Dryas really was an extreme transition. Who knew about it back then? Basically nobody. It was just, a small group. Probably not more than 100 people worldwide. If you said Younger-Dryas, how many people understood that, Younger-Dryas, that there was an Older-Dryas and the Younger-Dryas. The word Dryas comes from Dryas octopetala, which was this polar wildflower that had been prevalent in Europe during the late glacial maximum, the coldest depth of the ice age, disappeared during the warming that was basically between about 15,000 and 13,000 years ago in rough numbers, disappeared, and then suddenly came back again after 13,000 years ago. So the older Dryas, was the last period of severe glacial cold, and then that was punctuated by these two warming episodes, back-to-back warming episodes. And then they gave way to the Younger Dryas when the polar wildflower came back again and showed up. And then, of course, disappeared again at the end of the Younger Dryas.
I think it's safe to say that the number of Ice Age nerds has grown exponentially in the last 5 years due to Randall Carlson influence.
That's definitely true.
Well, that and Graham Hancock, of course.
No doubt.
Because, he was really focusing in Fingerprints of the Gods, he was really focusing in on the Younger Dryas and invoking a catastrophe, back before just about anybody was. And what he didn't do in Fingerprints of the Gods, and he said this himself, is really specifically identified the nature of the catastrophe. And he was drawing upon the work of Charles Hapgood, who came up with this idea of a crustal slippage, that the lithosphere moving with respect to the mantle, which I think there's an element of truth to that. I don't think it's fast enough, though, in order to explain the catastrophic events that Hapgood was attempting to explain with that idea. And then, of course, between 1996, when Fingerprints of the Gods came out, and when he began writing Magicians of the Gods, that is when the evidence was found for the impact event at the Younger-Dryas Boundary. And that's one of the things that he said made him want to go ahead and write that book. That's one of the strong pieces of evidence that said, I need to follow up on this. And that's when he decided that I need to locate Randall Carlson to take me across some of these flood zones in the Scablands to really get this up close. Mm-hmm. And we got to travel with him in fall of 2014. Yeah, so there was actually two things: the evidence for the Younger Dryas impact, and the other thing was the dating of Göbekli Tepe. Right. So it was those two things that was enough to bring Graham back on board with exploration and research, and gave birth not only to Magician of the Gods, but America Before.
I just looked up pre-boreal. I was just checking it out. It's 8350 BC to 7050 BC. That's what it says. 83
BC.
Right.
Yeah, so basically add a couple of thousand years to that to get BP. Right. And everybody knows, who listens to this now knows, I think, the difference between BC, which is before Common Era, and BP, which means before present.
Yeah, so it's 10,300 9,000 BP.
So then that's leading into what we talked about last episode, the climatic optimum. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Into the climatic optimum.
Right.
Which followed right on the heels of the Younger Dryas and leading into the early phases of the Holocene.
So the Balling and the Allerod are two different?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so they are.
They just mean that entire part of the Pleistocene?
Yeah, they're usually lumped together.
Okay. All right.
But they're actually two distinct stages within that Pleistocene Holocene transition. And I actually couldn't tell you why they are two distinct stages. I'm sure if we looked into it, it would be easy enough to answer. There's probably some line of demarcation there. It could be that 14,600 melting event, which coincides with Meltwater Pulse 1A, which was the first catastrophic rise event. It was John Shaw that coined the term catastrophic rise event, or CRE. A CRE is a catastrophic rise event.
Okay.
In ocean levels.
John Shaw that did the pioneering work on drumlins.
Yes, John Shaw, who did the pioneering work on drumlins, which we will definitely be exploring in much greater detail, because his work is really key to deciphering the whole thing, the transition.
So his name came up in the recent Nipigon impact video that we put up. So yeah, if people are keeping up with us, they've heard of him. But yeah, definitely worth going into deeper details about his research and his lifetime of being on the forefront of discovering these glacial age changes.
So yeah, he did the work on what I think of almost the definitive work on drumlins, and of course it was not accepted by mainstream, and there was a reason for that, and we're going to definitely be exploring that once we get into educating people about drumlins and how drumlins can be a very powerful diagnostic for reconstructing these events, these extraordinary events that were involved in the transition from glacial age to our present interglacial age. And so that'll be coming up, and it's going to be fascinating. And we would say that we were planning a trip to Lake Nipigon last year. It didn't work out because everybody's schedule was conflicted. We were going to go with George Howard, who does the Cosmic Tusk website, which is one of the best websites about the Younger-Dryas. So I would definitely give that a recommendation for people who want to learn more. Go to George's website. Anyways, he had talked to John. John was actually going to join us, and I think if John hadn't passed away, which he did shortly after that, I think we would have made it work on our end, because he was clearly getting up in years, and we knew that he was probably not long for this world. But after he said he in his word, he would be delighted to join us at Lake Nipigon. Tragically, he passed away within couple of weeks after that.
Less than a month, definitely.
Yeah, less than a month
from the invitation, and we said we're going, and he said he'd be delighted to go, and then he didn't last much longer, unfortunately.
However, the year or two before, we did spend 4 days in the field with Jerome Lesemann, professor of geology at Vancouver Island University, who was a graduate student under John Shaw and a co-author of this critically important paper that came out in the year 2000 called Channel Scablands Back to Brett's. Again, we'll be talking about that in great detail too. So we spent 4 days with him up in the drumlin fields of British Columbia, up on the Nechako Plateau, and explored those drumlin fields and the connection between those drumlin fields and the massive flooding that produced the scablands. And I definitely think we're on to what has to be the next phase of understanding the great scablands floods. Which again, that is something that, all of this is going to be the meat and material of our future podcasts over the next few months. We're going to be getting into and exploring all of this. So we have been talking about this transition between Pleistocene, Holocene, the termination of the Ice Age. And one of the things that has really stood out about this transition, of course, is the disappearance of worldwide of the great megafauna that were such an intrinsic part of the Ice Age for tens of thousands, in some cases hundreds of thousands of years. And I think it would be worthwhile to take a look at some of that, to look at some of the some of that bestiary and learning more about these critters that we humans cohabitated this planet with for probably at least 90% of the time that we've been around. And it's only like the last 5 or 10% of the time that we humans have been here that the world has been without these great megafauna. So I think it would be a good thing to go ahead and show people. I've got some interesting slides here we can look at to kind of set the stage here. So I'm going to do a screen share. Okay, here we go.
All right, we see it.
Oh, great. Okay, so here we've got basically the northern hemisphere. Look at the northern hemisphere, the distribution of ice masses in the northern hemisphere. And of course, right here you see Greenland, and up here you see the floating sea ice in the Arctic Ocean. And that was about the extent of the floating sea ice at the time this particular graphic was produced back in the 1970s. And it's really not that much different right now if we look at it. You notice there are large portions of open water here, but that's not going to be our subject. But, okay, so this is what basically you see the ice mass distribution in the northern hemisphere at present. So the next slide is going to be basically the same view, but looking at the ice masses during the late glacial maximum. And you can see that things were, there was a lot more area of the northern hemisphere buried under ice. Notice that the Arctic Ocean is completely choked off with ice. But some interesting things here. Notice Siberia is not glaciated. In fact, there's evidence of an open Arctic Ocean on the Siberian side during the late glacial maximum, which if true is going to be rather tricky to explain. And it is tricky to explain why this ice mass is not centered symmetrically about the North Pole. It's all lopsided to one side. You see that? So you can look over here and you can see that over this area, the ice might have been up to 2 miles thick. You know, there's a couple of different ways of modeling how much ice there was. But it would have been at least 1.5 miles, according to some calculations, and others maybe up to 2 miles thick over here, over the summit of the ice sheet. And then, so over here, we've got the Fennoscandian, as it's called, because it's buried. Basically, you'll notice that it's completely buried Scandinavia. And you'll notice here that this plain, this low plain here, is what is now the North Sea. So this is one of the areas that became a drowned with the 400-foot rise of sea level as the ice sheets were melting. So let's go to the next one. So this is a view at the end of the last ice age. And here you can see the two great ice sheets, the Laurentide Ice Sheet, which was the bigger of them, which was basically centered over Hudson Bay. Although most of the models suggest that it formed initially there were two nuclei, one on the east side, one on the west side of Hudson Bay. Those began to nucleate ice massing around those two spots, and then eventually it coalesced. And so if you look here, this was one of those nucleation spots, and then the other one was over here. And then over here we have the Cordilleran Ice Sheet. So it's important to note that there were two distinct ice sheets. And the nature of the connection between these two has always been of interest, because it's likely that during the warm period, the Balling-Allarod warm period, these ice sheets melted back enough that it opened up a corridor right here between the two ice sheets. And this was basically serving as the main idea for how the Western Hemisphere was ultimately populated, was that you had people migrating across the Bering land bridge up here and then coming down the ice-free corridor. And here's this showing the distribution of the Fennoscandian ice sheet here. So you can see that here the outline of the British Isles is here and Scandinavia is up here. The North Sea would be this. So the North Sea was above, basically was under the ice sheet. Then when the initial melting occurred, there was a massive lake in this area. And now, of course, it's under, the English Channel is right here, and the English Channel has evidence of massive scouring. Now, I've seen some of the dates, and the dates for that scouring that I've seen, and I haven't really scrutinized them in detail, suggest that it was an earlier event that created the scabland topography on the bottom of the English Channel. However, I'm sure that even if there were earlier events, the melting of the Fennoscandian certainly would have contributed to the erosional complex that's now on the bottom of the English Channel.
Is that what is referred to as Doggerland right there?
Yeah, that's it.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so now here is a global topographical relief map with the modern day coastlines. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at a few of these images here to get an idea of what land areas were submerged with the rising sea levels. Now, this particular map, if I recall, is showing a decreased sea level of 350 feet. I think that was what they were using. Given that at the late glacial maximum was at least 400 feet more, what that means is that this is a very conservative map when you start looking at what was actually exposed during the LGM or late glacial maximum. So now we'll go from this map to a 350 foot lower sea level. It's
actually, excuse me, Randall, it's actually labeled as 110 meters. So as you're saying, that's real close to 350 feet, but it's 110 meters.
Okay.
That's 360 feet, 360.8 feet. Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. So we could still drop it at least another 40 feet, which would expose even more land area. And so now you'll notice here, look up here at the Bering land bridge. And you see that the land bridge is actually bigger than the modern state of Alaska. And I've got some more detailed here. So here we can see North America. You'll notice the size of the shelf here that separates North America from Asia, right? Alaska from Siberia. And then when we drop sea levels 360 feet, we get that. Wow. So that was an extremely huge landmass that was densely populated with megafauna during the last ice age, which is really interesting because in order to be densely populated with megafauna, it had to have enough vegetation there for them to eat. You know, when you had the great herbivores, there had to be enough vegetation there for them to eat.
And then, it had to be ice-free. That's wild that, like, over, on what's now the continental U.S., we had ice coming down to so far south, and then over there in Alaska and Siberia, there was no ice, and there was flowering plants and stuff. That's pretty strange.
That is pretty strange, isn't it?
Well, and unfortunately, it doesn't show the ice sheet there. Right. That's the reason why the sea level is so much lower. But as we ended up in the previous episode, number 10, you can see that Florida's at least double its width.
Yeah. Yeah. When you here, I'll toggle back.
Oh yeah.
You see there, no Hudson Bay. Notice the land, all these islands up here, and the connection up here, northern Canada to Greenland.
Yeah.
Wow. Pretty wild, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay. Then here is, Indochina area. And this is what was called Sundaland. And when I drop sea level 360 feet, you see what happens? Look at how much land area you're check up from here all the way down. All of this now becomes exposed. So, we could certainly legitimately theorize that there might have been civilization of some kind in this area. Because for one thing, this would have been likely one of the more benign places on the planet to order to establish and build some kind of a culture or a civilization. But now you'll see how much of that got drowned. See, notice also this would be during these lowered sea levels is when the emigration to Australia likely took place. Now, Australia was populated at least 50,000 years ago. But what I'm saying is that it could have been an earlier glacial cycle that people first made it across. And I'm not saying they necessarily were able to walk across because they probably couldn't, but obviously sailing would have been much easier if you've only got to go 10 or 20 miles between islands, see?
Right. Yeah.
So then, and here's Northwestern Europe. And you'll see Scandinavia and the British Isles. Now we're going to drop sea level 360 feet.
So, there was a, Randall, I think I gave the copy of National Geographic to you, that talked about archaeologists were surprised to find that fish trawlers were bringing up artifacts from that area where the North is now. It completely surprised the archaeologists, and according to this article, that, wow, there were people there. Imagine that.
Yeah, well, over and over and over again. How many decades have I been saying, that we're really a lot of the important and critical archaeological finds in the next few decades are going to be marine archaeology. Yeah. Because literally during the ice ages, when sea levels were lowered, being on the coastlines is most likely the most benevolent place to put down roots.
It's still where the majority of the human population lives now, is along seacoasts and waterways.
Yes, exactly. And when you realize that sea level rise was not really a smooth process, but there were these interruptions, the CREs that I mentioned earlier, the catastrophic rise events. It means people would have had to uproot and move inland quite quickly. So, yeah, this gives folks an idea of the how vast these changes were. So, I guess I will stop share there.
So the total cumulative amount of ice that was packed in over North America, and including that Fennoscandian, is estimated at 6 to 7 million cubic miles.
Yeah.
Right, which is fairly, close equivalent to what's covering Antarctica today.
Yep.
So, that's the kind of amount of ice that's got to melt to raise sea level, nearly 400 feet. Like you explained before, you look a mile that way and a mile that way and then a mile up. Okay, you got a mile of cubic ice, and then multiply that by 6 million. It's just, it's hard to comprehend that's what was on the landscape and is now in the ocean.
Yeah.
And what happens to create that change? Somehow that much ice has got to transform into water and then get in the ocean basins. And there's no normal process on the earth that we typically see in modern history that's going to explain that. So there's got to be some, as you again spoke recently about the outrageous hypotheses. You got to think outrageously sometimes about these processes on the earth that transpire to create these sudden changes.
Yeah.
If you live in Canada, go outside, go a mile straight up, and you're still not on top of the ice yet. Basically, is what he's saying.
I've done that. I've laid on some gravel piles there in central Canada and thought, well, yeah, I'm still buried by a mile of ice here. Right. Everything that you see in Canada was buried. Everything across Canada was buried. It's a wild thought exercise to go through, and the people that live there are just could be in constant amazement of what shape what's outside their front door.
And, right. It is sort of a insight into what nature can do, the kinds of changes that nature can affect. Let's take it to the human perspective and say, okay, let's say that the government of Canada decides that they're going to pull out all the stops and they're going to lease all the forest lands of Canada to the big timber companies. And the timber companies are going to come in and they are going to clear cut from the Atlantic to the Pacific and from the 49th parallel up to the tundra, and they're going to cut every single tree, completely flatten it, right? We would think, oh my God, this is horrible. This is terrible to do such a thing like this. This is an obscenity. It's an abomination. Yet nature did that. Nature pretty much completely wiped out the forests that were in Canada, buried them under ice, and when the ice melted, of course, then the forest started coming back again. But literally,
the melt wiped out all the forests down below that, and
right.
yeah. I mean, the onset of the Laurentide Ice Sheet and the Cordilleran Ice Sheets pretty much clear cut the whole of Canada. See,
right, yeah. And then when they melted, it clear cut a bunch of stuff southward of that. That's what
yes,
he was
it did.
Yeah,
yes,
it did.
Yeah. So, the indigenous peoples of North America had many tales about life during those times, especially tales with respect to the great megafauna. And I've got a collection of those together that we'll address because they're pretty fascinating in their own right. Pawnee. There was a Pawnee hero stories and folk tales who talked about this. In the beginning, before making people, Tirawa, the creator, decided to create giant creatures to live in this world. Tirawa made them in many shapes, but in several ways they were all alike. They were very big and very strong. And lots of traditions have preserved memories of the great megafauna that went extinct at the end of the last ice age. And what's interesting about that is because within the context of all this new knowledge that's coming out, we have this boundary between the Bering-Alrod and the Younger-Dryas, which is dated to just under 12,900 years. And below that boundary, we find megafaunal remains and not above. And below that boundary, we find the evidence of North American habitation on the part of the Clovis people, who then disappear right at that boundary. So in terms of the animal life, that's something I'd like to kind of dwell on a little bit, because it's so fascinating and so interesting to, to contemplate this bestiary, this ice age bestiary that occupied North America, because most people are not really aware or cognizant of how the extent of this population of great animals. So we'll get into that a little bit here. Going back through, one of my early textbooks was The Earth Through Time by Harold L. Levin, geologist, which was from 1982. And he was referring to the Pleistocene and its occupants. And he said that the Pleistocene was a time of splendid diversity among mammals. The fauna was probably more varied and impressive than that of Africa a century ago. The Pleistocene was an age of giants in which colossal ground sloths, beavers over 2 meters tall, giant dire wolves, bison and tall rangy mammoths, and woolly rhinoceroses ranged far and wide across the continents. Earlier, way back in 1836, when Charles Darwin was exploring the American continent, this is what he said: "It is impossible to reflect on the state of the American continent without astonishment. Formerly, it must have swarmed with great monsters. Now we find mere pygmies compared with the antecedent allied races." And I think we'll do a few images here to help stimulate an appreciation of the nature of some of these beasts.
This is Kosmographia, the Randall Carlson podcast.